regarding the purpose of the study, as Maria mentioned, the digital transformation of the bioeconomy could in theory reduce gender bias, but unfortunately, gender bias seems to be increasing instead. And as a baseline for this project, we wanted to investigate the current state of knowledge. So what do we actually know about the intersection between gender, digitalization, and bioeconomy? And in this project, we, as you know, limit the bioeconomy to forestry and agriculture. So the aim of this review is to provide a foundation for informed discussions and decisions for actions. So by that, I would like to leave the word to Rina and say thanks from my side.
Thank you so much, Mimi. So I'll briefly and quickly tell you a little bit about the method we used for this literature review, and then I'll go on to the first topic, which is gender and bioeconomy. So as it was mentioned, there isn't much existing literature on gender and bioeconomy. So we decided to approach this issue by a systematic literature review to find linkages indeed between the three different thematic topics, which are gender, bioeconomy, and digitalization. These concepts were explored in pairs, and as you will later see, we draw the conclusions from each sections to also for the future objects project, but also to explore what is actually the current and future state of the digitalized bioeconomy and gender. The next slide, please.
Sorry, Rita, don't know what's happening. I'm trying.
Okay.
There we go.
Here we go. So this is the approach and quite the pathway which we went through for the literature review. So as mentioned, we started to explore these concepts in pairs, and we mainly used Google Scholar and Web of Science as search tools. We looked for academic articles as well as popular science publications, and that's why Google Scholar turned out to be quite useful for that. We looked at publications from mainly between 2015 to 2020, because the field of bioeconomy is actually developing quite quickly, so we wanted to stay relevant. So that's why the time limitation for that. We also used only English articles, even though there would have been a lot of material also in Scandinavian languages, but we chose to do it in English because the report will be written in English. So this way we could avoid further issues with, for example, translation. We also focused mainly on the geographical areas of Nordics as well as North America, essentially for two main reasons. The first being that the nature and the organizational structures of bioeconomy are somewhat relatable, as well as the gender equality questions. There would have been, however, quite a lot of literature also on Global South, but we came to the conclusion that perhaps the gender equality questions, for example, are somewhat different. We then compiled these articles under each topic. We reviewed them, ranked them, and categorized them by themes, which emerged from the articles. We also used reference and citation tracking as a snowballing method to find more relative articles. And in total, we found around 50 to 100 articles per pair. The next slide, please. So for the first theme, what were the main topics that we found? And this is regarding gender and bioeconomy. Well, we found that the existing literature explains how gender issues shapes everyday practices in work life. How does and why does the gender imbalance prevail within the fields of bioeconomy? And then thirdly, what is the relationship between sustainability, economic growth, and gender equality in bioeconomy? And these themes are not exclusive. They're rather mutually constitutive and overlapping. And it must be said here that the literature which focuses on gender and bioeconomy focused mainly on forestry. For the themes, the literature in the first theme explains that because forestry is historically seen as a masculine field, meaning basically that, very exacerbatingly said, that an accepted forestry worker is usually seen as a masculine man, or as a man in general, that impacts that even today. As the literature shows, the practical work within forestry is divided quite a lot according to the traditional gender lines. And the way in which this impacts the everyday life is that women and men have different access to knowledge and networks. And this again impacts the way in which men and women see and understand forestry and related works, and especially how they see the future and future economic possibilities within the bioeconomy. Then the second theme explains why these gender imbalances prevail. The research explained that because of the representation of bioeconomy remains quite masculine, female students, for example, don't want to seek employment from the field. Also discrimination, exclusion, sexual stereotyping or sexist behavior, sexual harassment, and challenges in balancing work and family life impact negatively on women's inclusion within the field. The literature also explained that in order to improve the situation, one could adopt, for example, quotas in the organizational structures. This is one way, but the studies also concluded that while this is quite useful to increase inclusion, it alone cannot actually change the masculine structures within the organization. So it's not by itself enough. Then the third team explored the linkages between sustainability and the future of bioeconomy and explained that women's inclusion is needed essentially for two main reasons, which are the economic competitiveness as well as social sustainability. And this later point regards to the fact that bioeconomy will increase its importance within the Nordic context, especially, and because of the gender imbalance prevails, the economic opportunities also are inclined in an equal manner. So that's it for me. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Lovisa.
Yes, thank you so much. Oh, and there we got the next slide. So the second topic we studied was the digitalization in the bioeconomy. And digitalization is shaping and reshaping society as we know it. And the bioeconomy is not an exception. So when turning to the most common themes identified within digitalization of the bioeconomy literature, the first one is that why data analytics and management are so important. And with the digitalization of bioeconomy, concepts such as smart farming, smart agriculture, and smart forestry are frequently used terms, emphasizing the use of ICT technologies within these sectors. And within these, researchers suggest that big data will have the greatest impact moving forward, where sensors collect large parts of data, enabling future cost-effective data collection. And with these vast amounts of collected data, we do, however, it needs to be managed and analyzed in order to bring real value. So looking at this rich data from the perspective of a farmer raises questions about data ownership, control, and also reliability. Because to use these hardware and software tools produced by machinery actors, farmers are often required to agree to certain terms and conditions. And in doing this, they often surrender most rights and inputs as to who controls the data. And these types of arguments raises questions about data governance and the importance of including the farmers in the process of developing technologies and the governance models to include their desired benefits from the digitalization, so because they are the ones in the end going to be using them. Moving on to the second theme that we identified for this topic was the social implications. The literature suggests that digitalizing the bioeconomy leads to some groups benefiting more than others, where the technical solutions being developed in the area seem to favor large corporate actors at the expense of independent farmers, mainly due to the affordability of the technologies, as it is an issue for the smaller farmers. Technologies such as those for precision farming do need quite large volumes to reach their full economic potential. And there's a concern that these private enterprises will benefit more from these technologies, which may lead to even increased resistance and the uptake of these technologies and a slowing down of the adoption. The literature also raises questions on labor hierarchies that will be affected, and that there may only be a small number of highly skilled workers that possess the knowledge of how to use these digital technologies to increase productivity within the bioeconomy. On the same note, it's highlighted quite frequently that the increased use of technology may result in marginalization of practical knowledge, which could ultimately lead to a disconnection between the workers and the landscape and the farming or forestry. And finally, the last theme identified here was the theme of adoption rates and difficulties in digitalizing. So the usefulness of technologies has been questioned along the lines of compatibility with existing farming technologies, which farmers and foresters have on their land, and routines where farmers are concerned about the level of transparency and also data calculations with the data collected. This is a type of lack of trust, and it's identified to be a social ethical barrier that to the acceptance of these digital tools within agriculture that might actually be larger than the actual technological challenges faced. And the low level of digital competence also an understanding of the benefits is also discussed from various perspectives, where within Swedish forestry, for example, it's a critical problem where the value chain has a lack of necessary competence in and digitalization forces them to be dependent on outside firms instead. And finally, the research also showed that farmers think it is difficult to identify when and where to invest their resources into the digital landscape, making it quite time consuming, and this also slowing down the process of digitalizing the bioeconomy. I think we can move on to the next slide. Yes, so moving on to the final topic studied, which was gender perspectives of digitalization. Digitalization is one of the many megatrends shaping our society, and it can't be fully understood without exploring the gender perspective. Rena spoke a bit about the gender perspective of bioeconomy, but and there are some similarities also to the gender perspectives of digitalization. So while digitalization is seen to create many opportunities for employment, it can, on the other hand, intensify existing inequalities. Researchers show this with two possible scenarios: one where digitalization acts to strengthen the existing male domination in industries, and the other where it opens up to kind of undoing the gender bias in the industry, emphasizing that this later scenario might be too optimistic. And that's kind of what we also are looking at here today. Another major issue in the labor market is women's underrepresentation in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, indicating that women are generally less likely to be positively affected by this increase in digitalization. And studies have also suggested that governments should create incentives and support women's access to these fields through education and other bridges, rather than just putting emphasis on women to breaking the glass ceiling and kind of fighting it out on their own way. So the second theme we identified on this area was the gender constructs and stereotypes, as technologies and opportunities in the digital area generally are considered to be more fields intended for men. And studies have examined participants' attitudes towards opportunities, which has revealed that women often saw technology, data, and digitalization as masculine fields. And these masculine constructions of technology and digitalization is also present in concrete ways today with regards to women's access to knowledge, their ability to perform work-related tasks, and negative stereotyping and harassment that going on. And for the last theme we identified within the digitalization and gender was that it provides both obstacles and opportunities in addressing the gender inequality. When students in ICT educations were interviewed, most female students aspired for a successful career within the IT industry, but because of childbearing responsibilities or existing gender stereotypes, they thought they would be less likely to achieve these career goals. And with the present gender inequalities in the digital transformation of industries, it is debated whether men or women stand the most to gain from this. On one hand, it's argued that the automation of jobs will affect those traditionally fulfilled by women to a greater extent. But on the other hand, it's claimed that the shift in employment towards occupations with less strict routines and physical work may favor women. And that's one of the areas that's also being studied within the bioeconomy. So to conclude, some aspects of the digitalization of and gender, they do have the potential to favor women at the workplace. However, they're not as many as initially thought, and they must be actively supported in order to not disproportionately favor men instead. And with that, I think we can move on to the conclusions. And Maria.
Thank you so much, Lovisa and Rina and Mimi. This is a slide and a figure that we keep returning to because we think it's important to keep these three concepts and the intersection between them as the core of our work. And this is basically summarizing the findings that were made in this literature review and what Rina and Lovisa have now been talking us through. So I don't think necessarily we need to dwell deeper into this slide, but we wanted to include it because you also find this in the report. And it is summarizing sort of the main points as we see it when we studied the literature. So looking at this intersection between digitalization and bioeconomy, we have these issues, as Lovisa mentioned, with the data management and questions associated to that, and also in terms of sort of what skills are actually required in the future. And likewise, then when we look at digitalization and gender, we have these 3 points that Lovisa was just going through. And then looking at gender and bioeconomy is what Rina was discussing, opening up this section. So this is a summarizing slide. And then for the next one here, we're going to sort of, okay, what does this say to us? What conclusions can we actually draw from this? And here we were trying to look at when these 3 circles, when all 3 of them meet, what's sort of in that intersection between the 3 different circles? Well, we believe we have this opportunity of a workforce shift ongoing. So there is definitely something happening within the bioeconomy. There's a different kind of skill sets that's asked for, and this could create an opportunity to actually act now. So we think that's one important aspect to keep in mind. And the other one is with regards to the different kind of initiatives to work with these questions, so female leaderships, mentors, and networks. And this is sort of a tricky field because here we need to look at both sides of the coin, so both advantages and possible challenges associated with using this kind of tools. We would like to sort of push for a critical reflection in terms of discussing all of these very interesting and in many cases probably helpful tools. But in terms of looking at mentors, for example, what potential challenges, what potential issues could we have? Should we set up sort of a mentorship with female mentors? Should it be male mentors? Should it be female mentees? Should it be male mentees? If we set female mentors and female mentees, is that then just accepting that the females need to change? It is a masculine norm that we should adapt to. I mean, there's a whole range of interesting aspects that need to be discussed. And then also in the report, we proposed 5 action points. And this we are so eager to discuss with you, and that's actually the agenda for the next hour. So I will just talk you through those, and you also find them in the report, and we will then get plenty of time to delve into these. The first one then, increase the number of female role models and thereby diversifying the masculine image, creating more inclusiveness. So could this be one way forward? Trying to have more women or female leaders in different places within the bioeconomy. That's the first. The second one, networks for young professionals and students in the bioeconomy to facilitate discussions and increase inclusive involvement. I think most of us probably think that this kind of discussions and networks are important, but how should they be organized then? How do we make sure that they're efficient? How do we make sure that they are inclusive, etc., etc.? But that's the second one. And then the third one, here comes the mentorship programs. To graduates, or should it be female? I mean, this could be discussed again, of course, to pursue careers in the digital bioeconomy. The fourth one, to pursue further research in the intersection of digitalization, bioeconomy, and gender, because that's actually one of the main findings here. There is quite a lot of literature within the crossing when we look at these different pairs, and that's why we organize this literature in that way. But looking at the intersection of the three key concepts here, there's not that much literature. So that's something we would like to ask for. And then the fifth one that we raise here, develop tools and methods to incorporate this topic, gender in the digitalized bioeconomy, in university educations. And this directly, of course, relates to this method handbook and what we would like to discuss during the spring and like to do within this project.